Okay, so we are adding the participants. Everyone, please turn your microphones off.
स्क्रीन पे तो आना चाहिए कैमरा हमारा ऑन.
Okay, so I think with this we can begin. We still have people joining. Actually, they still have people joining the discussion. Okay, so Dr. Correa, I think we can begin the webinar. Please, your opening remarks. Professor Correa is the Executive Director of the South Center, and without further ado, I hand the floor over to him. Dr. Correa, your microphone is muted.
Yeah.
Yes, it's audible now.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's audible now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So I didn't mute it, so something in the system is operating. Well,
Yeah.
then I start again. On behalf of the South Center, we want to welcome you very warmly to this webinar. We are very happy that this is being organized jointly with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. As you know, the South Center is an intergovernmental organization, but we work very closely with a number of non-governmental organizations, such as now the case of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. So we're very happy to cooperate in order to promote the interest of developing countries, the interest of the South. Certainly, it's very clear for you that we are now in a very critical time in which our governments, in particular in developing countries, need to generate essentially income in order to face the COVID-19 health and economic crisis. As we know, in many developing countries, the capacity to get tax income has been drastically reduced because of the situation of the economic activity, of the confinement, and also because many small and medium companies cannot actually pay their taxes. So this is a very timely discussion. At the same time, we know that foreign direct investment, ODA, other sources for foreign financing of developing countries is also going down. Therefore, the role of tax authorities at this time is absolutely crucial. I think now everybody in developing countries and do recognize that your work, the work of those who are in charge of tax authorities, who are thinking, designing the tax system, is absolutely crucial. So at this point, we are facing this particular and very serious problem. But of course, there are more structural issues that the tax community needs to face. In particular, one of these issues that is going to be discussed at this webinar is how to tax the so-called digital economy. So we have some issues which may be seen as short-term, but there are also many important long-term issues that the tax community in developing countries must address in a very serious and coherent manner. And certainly we need to increase the capacity of developing countries to work together, to make their voice heard in international negotiations, to ensure that there is a fair distribution of the taxation rights, which is not now the situation. And therefore, these kind of meetings that South Center is very happy to sponsor are very important in order to get more input and to look into concrete measures that developing countries can adopt in order to face this situation, and as I mentioned, also to look at the long term. So we are very, very, very happy also that we have for this webinar a number of prominent tax administrations as speakers, as well as academics and representatives of NGOs. So it's a great team. And also, thank you very much, Abdul, and the tax team, the South Center, for preparing this. As you know, the tax team is working very hard in developing studies, in interacting with tax authorities in order to push the agenda of developing countries in this area in the way that developing countries need, that is a fairer international tax system that responds to the interests of developing countries. I think, Abdul, you can start with a substantive discussion. And thank you very much to all the speakers and the participants. And let's hope that we remain in contact and working together in order to strengthen the capacity of our developing countries and our people to get a better system of international taxation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Correa, for your opening remarks. I now hand the floor over to Dr. Derege Aremayu, Executive Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Derege, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Abdul. I will leave any comment on the topic of the webinar because it is going to be handled by a range of experts. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice is an alliance of 5 continental tax justice networks in Africa, Asia, Latin America and Caribbean, North America and Europe. We campaign to stop tax evasion and avoidance by multinationals and wealthy individuals, for a progressive, redistributive and just tax systems in individual countries, and for a fair distribution of taxing rights globally, for the reform of international tax system within the framework of the United Nations, the only inclusive institution in which developing countries could defend their interests by being at the negotiation table with equal rights. Multilateralism is in a multiple crisis. It is threatened by blackmail and gangsterism to prevent it from addressing key global and structural issues such as tax dodging and illicit financial flows. Those profiting from the status quo are blocking reform of the international financial architecture through an inclusive process. They are at the same time defending and promoting the usurpation of this role by their own organization called the OECD, the Club of the Rich. Developing countries have more at stake to defend the UN system and multilateralism. They will remain victim of divide and rule tactics if they don't work together. They cannot stop tax dodging and illicit financial flows on their own as individual countries. For me personally, this is a small initiative towards an ambitious goal: to resuscitate the spirit of Bandung, or the non-aligned movement, which forged the solidarity and cooperation of developing countries to overcome poverty and inequality. It is for the creation of a better world for all, not a world divided up as sphere of looting between powerful nations. Thank you, and I wish you a successful deliberation.
Thank you so much, Derege, for your strong views which have consistently stood up for the rights of the developing countries, especially in international tax matters and the importance of the Global South. Without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to our kickoff speaker, Lydie Naspel, who is a coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and who will enlighten us on the challenges of domestic resource mobilization in the Global South amidst the COVID crisis. Lydie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to apologize. I cannot open my video because it pulls on my bandwidth and you might lose my consideration. I'd like to start by saying that domestic mobilization of resources, by saying it's a challenge, is really a huge understatement. for the South. No, we are burdened by many obstacles. Many of our societies are legacies of a long history of colonial plunder that has left us with economic systems that are oriented for the generation of profits for multinational corporations and big business, often in joint ventures with our country's elites. These economic systems are often supported by political structures and states dominated by the very same elites. The economic plunder and over-concentration of majority of our people continue at even a much faster, almost unfettered pace through neoliberal globalization. Our countries are impoverished, but this is not because we are incapable of generating wealth. Much of our country's wealth, natural resources, as well as wealth generated by our hardworking people, leave our countries in the form of illicit financial flows, capital flight, profit repatriation, interest payments on unsustainable and illegitimate debts, losses from underpriced exports and overpriced imports and unfair trade relations, and this wealth that stolen by corrupt government officials. This is borne by hard facts. On the balance sheet, there is a net outflow of resources from the south to the north. One of the biggest myths that continue to be perpetuated is that we lack wealth and capital, and that is used to justify the overzealous pursuit of foreign investments and loans. I would just like to share here a set of demands and calls that have been put together by Southern movements working on tax justice, those that work with the Global Alliance on Tax Justice. And a set of this is about stopping wasteful tax incentives benefiting wealthy elites and corporations, preventing multinational corporations from shifting profits to low and zero tax countries by taxing them as a single entity based on a unitary enterprise principle, and by demanding for debt cancellation of unsustainable and illegitimate debts that we are paying to international financial institutions, bilateral as well as private lenders, especially immediately the cancellation for debt-distressed developing countries to give governments more fiscal space. Another set of demands and calls one is to levy excess profits taxes on multinational firms, especially those profiting massively from the crisis, pursuing progressive reforms that heavily tax large incomes, assets, and wealth, canceling bilateral tax treaties that are grossly disadvantaging depending on the OECD BEPS process, and introducing a global minimum corporate tax rate that is sufficient to fund quality public services and universal social protection, including universal health coverage, but without any country being pressured to reduce their existing corporate tax base. We also call for the reform of global tax rules and architecture, and among the most immediate demands and calls we have is the establishing of a global tax body under the auspices of the UN that can support the global reconstruction strategy that will be required to avoid the pressures that impact most also call for the promotion of domestic and regional tax transparency measures to curb illicit financial flows, including public country-by-country reporting for multinational corporations, public registers of beneficial owners of legal entities, and the automatic exchange of information. We also call for strengthening the fight against harmful tax practices, including transfer pricing, tax avoidance, and the use of offshore financial services. Next, we also say that tax justice is also about alleviating the burdens of the poor and the vulnerable. So we call for the repeal of regressive services taxes. And we call for the granting of tax credits to single-headed households, mostly headed by women, to micro, small, and medium enterprises, to low-income earners, dependents, and others. And we especially call for tax credits for women for unpaid care work. We also are always saying that there is no tax justice without fiscal and economic justice. This is not just about mobilizing resources for governments, but ensuring that these resources are used for the welfare and the interest of our people. So we call the states to uphold their core mandate and duty to protect and give primacy to human rights, not banks and corporations and the rich. It's called starting a fiscal path that provides stimuli and support for the real economy, not speculative financial activities, towards equitable and just economic structures, policies, and programs. We also ask for fiscal policies that invest in universal social protection systems, public investments that ensure food security and food sovereignty, especially during the current crisis. Public services that address and fulfill the rights and needs of women, including those that recognize, reduce, reallocate, and socialize unpaired care work and social reproduction. We ask for formal employment protection measures as well as basic emergency income to cover unemployed workers, informal and self-employed workers living in poverty and whose conditions are exacerbated by the lockdown and quarantine procedure during away from the discredited economic policies of neoliberal globalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liddy, for your wide-ranging address, which covered the macro and the very micro issues, as well as the multilateral responses which are required to bring about a more sustainable and equitable tax order, and for laying the floor for a more technical discussion, which is now going to be led by our first speaker from the panel, Mr. Eric Mensah, who is the co-chairperson of the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, who would be speaking on the theme of redistributing taxing rights to developing countries, the two-pillar approach and the way forward. Mr. Mensah, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abdul, and thank you all for joining this webinar. And I will kick off my presentation by saying that these are opinions that I'm holding personally, and it does not reflect on any other organization or body I'm connected with. And that leaves me the privilege to be able to, give some kind of innovative proposals. Fortunately, too, I have Mr. Banzal, my colleague on the committee, on this panel, and he's more conversant with the digital taxation issues. I have divided my discussion into two parts: the two-pillar approach, what is it, and then any alternative approach. By way of background, please let me briefly recount my understanding of what the current stage of the discussions on the digital economy is. The tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy was identified as one of the main areas of focus of the BEPS project, leading to the 2015 BEPS Action 1 report. For direct taxes, the Action 1 report observed while digitalization could exacerbate BEPS issues, it also raises a series of broader tax challenges, which it identified as nexus, data, and characterization.
Hello.
The later challenges, however, were acknowledged as going beyond BEPS and were described as chiefly relating to the question of how taxing rights on income generated from cross-border activities in the digital age should be allocated among jurisdictions. Possible options to address these concerns were identified, but none were agreed or ultimately recommended as part of the BEPS package. To advance progress towards a consensus-based solution, the G20 OECD BEPS Inclusive Framework members made a number of proposals, some of which focus on the allocation of taxing rights through modifications to the rules on nexus and profit allocation, and others on unresolved BEPS issues. The Inclusive Framework agreed a policy note in January 2019 that grouped the proposals into two pillars, one of nexus and profit allocation, and another on ensuring a minimum level of taxation, and contain an agreement to examine them as a possible basis for consensus. On Pillar 1, the policy note recognized that in the balance are the allocation of taxing rights between jurisdictions, fundamental features of the international tax system, such as the traditional notions of permanent establishment and the applicability of the arm's length principle, the future of multilateral tax cooperation, the prevention of unilateral measures, and the intense political pressure to tax highly digitalized and multinational enterprises. In an attempt to arrive at a consensus on the principles of Pillar 1, I believe an approach described by the Inclusive Framework as a unified approach was developed to deal with the tax revenue losses from digitalization by giving market jurisdictions access to more tax revenue, Pillar 1, and by effectively introducing a global minimum tax rate, Pillar 2. Not having been actively involved in the negotiations, I'm not an expert on the two-pillar approach or the current unified approach discussions. To be candid, I do not pretend to fully understand all the issues. Fortunately, my focus in this discussion is not on these approaches, but a way forward for developing countries in fashioning out a workable mode of taxing the digital economy. The first question I ask is, can the current global talks by the international tax bodies on taxing the digital economy lead to a multilateral solution beneficial to developing countries? In an article discussing the options available to developing countries, Jeroen Lammers of the University of Amsterdam states that he does not believe the claims that a unified approach will produce similar revenue gains for both developing and developed economies. He argues that looking at the data in terms of compensation for tax revenue lost to avoidance, or in absolute amounts, it is clear that the potential rewards for developing countries are quite small. In comments by the UN Tax Committee on the Unified Approach, whilst commending the attempt for an inclusive, consensus-based approach at finding multilateral solutions by the IF, which was released for public consultations, the UN Tax Committee expressed its disquiet in the exclusion of the principle of the significant economic presence, which was important for developing countries, and which was a focal point of some of the contributions that were made by some developing country-oriented organizations like the G24 and the UN. So the question is there an alternative approach? New developments from the discussions on the taxation of the digital economy seems to suggest that a multilateral solution to the issue may not be possible immediately, if ever. So for developing countries, what is the alternative? I believe that there's a narrow window of opportunity for developing countries to fashion out a new taxing model that will assure some significant taxing rights in the digital space. This can be done by proposing new forms of discussion and new negotiating platforms. Moving away from the current discussions at the IF and maybe the UN and other global forums, I believe that the time has come for a new negotiating platform. And I put forward a concept similar to the third international conference on financing for development, which came out with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Such a conference can have the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD operating on an equal footing with a clean slate, but taking cognizance of work that has already been done and using the various proposals already on the table as starting points for negotiation. The aim is to achieve a simple, easy to administer and implement a taxing module on the digital economy, recognizing the contributions of both developed and developing countries to the profitability of the digital companies. An agreement could then crystallize into a multilateral instrument, immediately implementable once ratified. I know this may seem far-fetched, and reasons why it may not be workable will speedily be advanced. But the question is, for developing countries, what do we have to lose? For far too long, developing countries have been like spectators at a championship football match. Not only are they not playing the match, but even are unable to enter the stadium and are limited to watching the match from giant screens outside. Their involvement only begins when the match is over and they are asked to join the victory parade outside. There I say more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mensah, for so candidly laying forth your views and laying out the brief history of the discussions which have culminated in the two-pillar approach. And this is indeed a big idea which you have put forward for everyone to consider about the need for a new forum where these discussions can take place and a new agreement can be found which would be in the interest of developing countries, and for strongly raising the point that for too long developing countries have been like spectators in a game where they have not been equal participants. To elaborate on this, on how developing countries can offer alternatives on taxing the digitalized economy, I would now invite Mr. Rajat Bansal, a member of the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, to share his views. Mr. Bansal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much to South Center and Global Tax Alliance for Justice, Global Alliance for Tax Justice for organizing this timely seminar on a very contemporaneous topic of tax policy options for funding the post-COVID recovery in the Global South. The timing could not have been more opportune when the world is looking towards sources of revenue, especially for the developing countries, to fund the health-related crisis and for their own development. At this stage, organizing this seminar is really very relevant and contemporaneous. I would say that we all know the importance of revenue in development of countries, especially the developing countries, and the Addis Ababa conference laid emphasis on domestic resource mobilization by these countries. So in that context, the speaker before me, Mr. Mensah, set the tone for the taxation of digital economy, and the topic assigned to me is alternative approaches by developing countries for taxing the digital economy. So I'd just like to give you a brief background of this topic, because some of you may not be familiar with what has happened in this area over the past few years. So as you know that it's possible for with increased electronic means of communication and electronic means of selling, the share of economic activity by digital companies, most of them multinational enterprises, has increased over the years, and the revenue they are deriving is from market economies, most of them are in developing world, and still they don't have the taxing right. They can tax these companies under their domestic law, but they are severely handicapped because the tax treaties allow taxation only subject to certain rules of which are centuries old and which are tilted towards the residence countries. Am I audible, Abdul? Abdul, am I audible perfectly?
Yes, sir. So you're perfectly audible.
Oh, thank you. So now the forum where this was taken up was in 2013 in the OECD in the BREPS project, and a number of things were done in that project. Simultaneously, the Global Forum for Tax Transparency took measures for increasing the transparency by ushering in automatic exchange of information, by setting right the framework for exchange of information on request. All this was done. But what remained unaddressed and which was very crucial for the developing world was allocation of taxing rights, because the revenue that a developing world or market economy can legally derive is as per the tax treaties, which are having the rules in favor of the residence countries. So there was a action plan on taxation of digital economy also in the BEPS action plan, but no conclusion could be reached, and it was left with three options to the countries to exercise if they wish to, but no multilateral solution was proposed at that stage. Work thereafter continued under the aegis of inclusive framework, where further work was done on this, but so far we haven't seen a solution under the inclusive framework. Simultaneously, following the BEPS Action Plan 1, some countries took unilateral measures to tax the digital economies by levying what can be called DSTs or digital service taxes, or as it is called in India, equalization levy, which was as per recommendation of the BEPS Action Plan. But this tax is a unilateral measure, not falling under the tax treaty, and concerns of double taxation remain. But this had a positive effect, and the countries in the world speeded up their work to look at the solution for taxing the digital economy in a multilateral manner. Now, in inclusive framework, certain solutions have been proposed. Three approaches were proposed, and they were diverse approaches, and finally something called a unified approach has been proposed. I'll now turn to the work done in the United Nations Tax Committee, of which I am a member in my personal expert capacity, as to what happened there. We also constituted a subcommittee in 2017 to work on taxation of digital economies, and we decided to work independently of other forums, mainly to keeping in view the interest of the developing countries, and also keeping in view that it is not necessary that the solution found in other forums may be in the exact interest of the developing countries. So our work continued simultaneously while studying the work done in inclusive framework and other forums. We also continued working in the United Nations Tax Committee. This year, in the recent committee meeting in June 2020, since we had decided to work independently, I had proposed an approach before the meeting, and that approach was discussed. And based on that approach, it was decided that a drafting group will be constituted to propose an approach which will then be considered by the committee. How this approach was differed from what was being done in other forums, I'll briefly touch upon. The main, there can be various ways of taxing digital economy in terms of scope and the method used. By scope, I mean which sectors would be covered, and by method, I mean the method to compute the profits attributable to the market economy. So there can be various ways, and there is no dispute about that. One has to finally agree on this, but there can be many ways. Now, according to me, there are four elements important to any approach that should be adopted, which are in the interest of developing economies. The first one is that the approach should be simple. The second one is that it should result into some significant revenue for the developing world. Otherwise, there is no point in having any such approach. And the third one is that there should be elimination of double taxation. Otherwise, the same income will be taxed in two countries. And lastly, there should be a viable and definite mechanism to resolve disputes, if any, they arise out of such a method. So we are working under these parameters to come up with an approach that can be adopted by in the UN model. UN model is the model which is used for tax treaty negotiations between developing and developed countries, and it has a great persuasive value. It itself is not a tax treaty, but it has a persuasive value, and most of the developing countries as well as developed countries, when negotiating with developing countries, treat it as something having weightage, and they do try to follow it. So if any such provision gets inserted in the UN model, it will be really a big achievement. Another aspect I'll tell you is in terms of implementation. The approach being, if you talk about an approach where all countries need to participate in determination of the share of each country in the profits of a multinational entity, then it becomes very cumbersome. And then what happens is that if one piece of this whole picture is disturbed, then the entire picture gets disturbed. This is not the way we have been taxing the multinationals so far. The approach so far has been that the country where multinational is present, it is taxed locally on that, based on local thresholds and not on global thresholds. So these are another elements which were highlighted in the proposal made by me to the United Nations Tax Committee. And I think these are very important aspects for coming up with a simple solution. So I think these are some of the points I wish to put before you as in terms of the alternate approach that we are contemplating at United Nations. As you know, this is a committee of 25 members, and any solution will depend on acceptance by the committee. We are very hopeful. Myself and Mr. Mensah both are working towards finding a solution along with our other members, both from developing and developed countries. So we hope for the best. So with this, I'll stop here, Abdul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal, for laying out the elements of a solution which would have realistic prospects of bringing in revenue for developing countries, and the importance of local thresholds, which have been hitherto the norm in international taxation, and the need for continuity using these norms. And I'm sure the audience would have a great deal of questions for you and your, as they would for all the other speakers. And without further ado, I hand the floor to the next speaker, Daniel Uribe Teran, who's a program officer with the South Center, who will give us some practical options or tax policy options with regard to the digital economy, specifically at the national level. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abdul. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. I will be basing my presentation today in a document that we prepare together with Abdul and with Veronica Grondona that couldn't not join today. I will be pasting the link for that paper, which was developed with the South Center, so that you can take a look at it for specific details. Given the time, for sure you will understand we cannot go to specifics. So you can find it now in the chat window. So basically, we are looking at three particular issues. One is why it is necessary to now discuss even more about taxing the digital economy. Then we will go to certain actions that the states are taking. We call them national actions rather than unilateral measures, because there is a demeaning tone in the issue of unilateral measures. We think that a national measure is a better approach, given that states have the sovereign right to tax what they think is justified to them. So that is an issue of national measures that states have been taken until now. And then after I will discuss certain findings that we have in that particular paper. So on the first issue, and just let me know if I'm going too fast. There is a fact that the current situation has created an income gap and inequality, which we know that in the world was actually ramping before COVID-19. In the 2019 Human Development Index report, the United Nations established that there is actually a new generation of inequalities, which I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, is completely linked to what countries are facing right now. There is a lack of access to quality of health at all levels, a lack of access to high quality education at all levels. There is a lack of effective access to present day technologies, and there is a lack of resilience to unknown new shocks. So those were the findings in 2019. We see that now it is actually coming even more. With the pandemic, all countries are going back to consideration of the recovery phase rather than just accessing on these particular enhancing capabilities. And we are going back to the idea of protecting childhood survival, primary education, entry-level technology, and resilience to current shocks. So these are elements which are important to consider. All of this has led to the need of mobilizing resources for the recovery that shouldn't be limited only to facilitation and promotion of foreign direct investment, or ODA, as was widely mentioned before my presentation. But it should strengthen the state capabilities and capacities to increase revenue collection at the domestic level. And I think that here is the key of the issue. So although we know that the economy has suffered dramatically, it's important to understand that now the wealth of particular or personal individuals in the world has been increasing in a manner which is not believable. So tech billionaires that have increased their net worth during these 6 months more dramatically than the rest of the world, even considering that 90% of working population is living in countries that have to impose lockdowns and they are without jobs or made redundant. So given that in order to kind of respond to these kind of measures, it's required to push for a stimulus package, it's essential to start discussing back the issue of national measures towards the taxing of digital economies. So there is one of the findings, the particular finding is that there is a proliferation of national measures in the issue of digital tax. So one is digital service taxes, which have been implied more or less by the majority of states, particularly from the OECD. New nexus rules, mainly significant of economic presence, withholding taxes on digital transactions, and measures that flow from a hard-end right to obtain developing countries to take the necessary action to address the tax challenges of the digital economy, in absence of multilateral solutions. One of these issues, which is important to develop, is the idea of the digital service tax. So what is a digital service tax? This has been developed widely by particularly countries from the OECD. Half of countries of the OECD have actually applied this kind of digital service tax, which implies that the states will start taxing profits that are generated in their territory by non-residents, even if that company has no physical presence there. So it actually reflects the development on how profits are attributed, and they consider particularly the added value where it is created, particularly the user value added. So, for example, in these cases, one of the issues that, one of the elements which has been taxed is the advertisement. So, placing on digital interface, for example, on advertising targeted at users of a particular online interface, provision of underlying supplies of goods and services in the digital interface, or sale of data of collected users. On these particular issues, I just want to mention some estimates. So Spain, for example, is one of the countries that have applied this element, and they consider that by the end of 2020, this was without the COVID-19 hitting. They believe that by 2020, they will the tax collection will rise to almost 968 million euros. In the case of the UK, that amount was reaching 280 million by the end of 2020. Then we go to another kind of application, which is the comment of diverted profit tax. So this has been applied by the United Kingdom. This is not directly only to this kind of online enterprises, but actually they look at the corporate tax rate, which is in a higher proportion if the company is using certain kind of arrangements, structural arrangements that allow them to avoid the payment of certain taxes. This is more or less known as the possibility of abusing tax planning. So if the company has this kind of mechanisms, then the state has the right to increase or to establish a higher corporate tax rate on that particular structure. Another of the efforts taken by developing countries and also developed countries is the idea of significant economic presence. Mr. Mensah and Mr. Bansal have already discussed about this particular issue, and the idea is that the concept expands from the definition of creating a business connection with non-resident companies which are located in one state or conduct certain certain activities in one state. So the idea is to increase the concept of business connection to create a new digital nexus where a tax where tax business profits of foreign businesses are based on significant economic presence. The idea in general terms is that a nexus will exist even without physical presence when there is a determination that revenue generated on a sustained basis is the basic factor for a combination of one or more of different key elements. For example, the existence of a user base which is associated with data, the volume of digital content which is derived by a particular company in a particular jurisdiction, billing or collection of local currency, the fact that the company has, for example, a website that is located in the domain of that particular country. For example, if you enter into a website in Switzerland, you will see that the last part is .ch, which includes the Helvetic Confederation. That implies that that particular website is located in Geneva, even if the company or the warehouse of that company is located outside. That particular website is located in Switzerland, and therefore there is a nexus which is created. Another element which I will leave the particular details for Mr. Benza, because he is the expert of this particular element, is the issue of fractional apportionment as a mechanism for taxing the digital economies. Just in a really broad sense, this element actually applies a mechanism in which is a simpler mechanism to allocate particular tax collection to jurisdiction. It is looking at an apportion of taxes, particularly of a company that has conducted certain activities in one jurisdiction, and is particularly based on key mechanisms like sales, assets, manpower, and users. After that, another element which has been applied is the withholding tax on digital transactions. This, without unduly delayed, is particularly the application of digital tax, basically. But instead of applying it directly to the company rendering the service, the states have decided that that kind of application will be withholding, particularly or the user or the financial institution facilitating the transaction. So that particular withholding tax will be taken directly by the financial institution or directly by the buyer or the user. Some of the key findings that we have found is that first, at least half of OECD countries are actually at the forefront of taking these kind of national measures. So it's not an issue that is only raised by developing countries. Some are issues which are raised directly by OECD countries. Then that national measures have positively impacted the multilateral discussion. I will not enter into the details, but if you consider, for example, how part of these kind of digital mechanisms or national measures have been applied by different countries, after they have applied these kind of mechanisms, the multilateral organizations have started to discuss this even broadly and more dynamic in a more dynamic matter. What is important to highlight here is that these kind of measures do not require it is not an issue of adopting one or the other. While discussions are taking place at the multilateral stage, you can continue applying national measures. It's your right and is based on the sovereignty of the states. So this is a particular issue that it has to be highlighted. I think that with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much, Abdul. I hope that there was no issue with the connection, and I am open with any questions after the presentations are final. Thank you, Abdul.
Thank you, Daniel, for so clearly laying out what are the practical measures countries have started taking to actually start collecting money from the digital economy. As a co-author of his paper, I would urge everyone to have a look at the link which he has shared in the chat function, and would also just add that the fractional apportionment method which he had referred to is something which is much easier for developing countries to implement at the national level as compared to formulary apportionment, because fractional apportionment requires much less data. It doesn't require the consolidated group profits. It doesn't require country by country reporting data, which many developing countries are struggling with, which is one of the reasons why the G24 had put this as their preferred method of profit attribution. And as my colleague Daniel has pointed out, these are measures which are completely within the sovereign rights of countries to undertake, because under Chapter 7 of the Action 1 report, these have been laid out as BEPS safeguards measures which can be taken by countries till an multilateral solution is found out. So countries very much should encash to the extent possible their right actually under international law to undertake national measures to tax the digital economy. But of course, the digital economy, while increasingly inseparable from the real economy, is still not all of it. And there are still many other aspects of the real economy on which tax policy measures can be applied. So I would invite the next speaker, Mr. Ricardo Martner, a commissioner of ICRICT, and also a very esteemed member of the United Nations. He headed the Fiscal Affairs Unit of the ECLAC in Latin America. So Mr. Martner, I invite you now to share your views on what are the domestic options for developing countries for financing the COVID recovery.
Thank you. I think you're hearing me. I would like to.
Yes, Mr. Martner, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I would like to be. I'm very happy to be with you in this webinar and to share with all these people. Since we cannot travel, it is a very nice way to see you all. I was asked to speak about the financing after the COVID or during the COVID-19. I will, since we cannot travel again, I will have a Latin American perspective. So I'm sorry if I'm not sure that what the things that I will say has to do with Asia or Africa or whatever. So from our pandemia view, we have a very serious drop on GDP. International organizations are estimating 10% of a fall of GDP in the average in Latin America, with very high numbers in many countries, and a very serious pandemia in many of the main cities of Latin America. The clusters are really in the big cities, practically everywhere, and without any difference between different policies of confining or locking down. So that's our reality. Of course, fiscal deficits will attain something like 10% of GDP in many countries, and many countries are financing these deficits with debt in this moment. Some of them had access to capital markets with low interests. So it has been, from that point of view, an important issue. But this debt has to be paid in the future. So there's where, ICRICT has made a report recently with essentially 5 measures to recommend to governments, which are linked with the discussion we had here in the webinar, and also linked to the discussion of two main elements: is the setting a minimum effective corporate tax rate, which is a very important discussion to avoid the tax competition within countries, either at the regional level or at the global level. And the discussion of the word effective tax rate set at 25%. It was one of the discussions that we had in ICRICT some months ago, because there's so many exemptions in the corporate tax rate. So it would be, I would say that none of the countries in the region have that level of tax rate, 25%. So the first thing to do is to revise and to analyze and to discuss the exemptions in the corporate tax rate, because it's an element that is crucial for the future. I know that in this moment, everybody is discussing rather the deferments or the reduction of tax corporate rates, but we believe in ICWIC that the discussion is the other way around, how to have a good effective tax rate, because mainly we will have an active state in the future, in the near future, and public investment will be key to the recovery. So that's one point that I had to speak about, and the second is about also, digital tax rates are important, but I'm not sure that they collect very much in our countries, since we are not still very digitalized economies. So we have to reach funding from other sources. One of them is the wealth tax. Many countries, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, are discussing the wealth tax. For instance, here in Chile, in the parliament, they are trying to make a vote about a tax wealth for the super rich, and that would represent something like 2 points of GDP. This is a very, I think, overestimated amount, but the discussion is there. And the report in ICIC is very insists a lot about to publish data on offshore wealth, the financial transparency that is so important to have an effective wealth tax. But the discussion of a progressive tax system goes further than that, especially because administrations in our countries are not used to have a progressive system. Everybody is glad when they have a higher collection of VAT, which they shouldn't, because the important thing is to have a progressive system. This is a very difficult issue in the future, but I think we have to be prepared to make more efficient administration tax systems in the whole developing countries, and that is a political question. So let me just stop here and thank you everybody to a very interesting webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Martner. The importance of the tax rate is certainly an essential question when many developing countries see a race to the bottom. And the question of improving tax administration usually doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, actually. So I would now invite the next speaker, Mr. Charles Abugre, who's a member of the Technical Advisory Council of Tax Justice Network Africa. And he would speak on the importance of and the role of South-South cooperation in facing the COVID crisis. Mr. Abugre, the floor is yours. Mr. Charles Abugre, your microphone might be muted. Mr. Abugre. There seems to be some connectivity issue over here. No, unfortunately, we still can't hear you. I'm sorry, Mr. Abugre. Perhaps you could try rejoining the call. that may work. Mr. Charles, if you can hear me, I would recommend trying to rejoin the call. That may work.
Abdul, is it possible we could do questions whilst you wait for Mr.
Okay. Yeah. So while Mr. Charles rejoins us, we could proceed with the question and answer session. So yes, if anyone has questions, please press the button to raise your hand. We may not be able to see everyone's videos, so therefore we request you to raise your hands, and then we will give you a chance to speak to the panelists.
He's back again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Phew. Okay. Apologies. Okay. Apologies, everybody. Okay. I was asked to talk about South-South cooperation in the context of the COVID-19 induced economic crisis. Am I still clear before I keep on?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it's actually building and drawing from the presentations that have already been made, and I will try to also draw quite a bit from recent work that has been done on South-South cooperation, including by UNCTAD and UNDESA and others in this context. So currently, what's the context? There are four key contextual issues to emphasize in relation to developing countries, emerging economies and developing countries, and their ability to both manage and transition from the COVID-induced economic crisis and build resilience. The first is that already most of the countries have a high economic vulnerabilities. Secondly, they have very low levels of preparedness and very harsh and poor underlying social and economic conditions. And thirdly, they have a low capacity to respond on their own. And fourth, they have a low capacity to recover on their own. And finally, they have a low capacity to build resilience towards, against a future similar crisis. And therefore, cooperation is absolutely critical. But given what has our experience of efforts so far to draw from the Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Given our experience so far to draw from, from international global entities, both the UN system and the Bretton Woods institutions and G20 to support the recovery and the management of the COVID crisis by developing countries, I think South-South cooperation is central. And there are at least three or four important favorable conditions. The first is that the South and developing countries need each other. I think the current geopolitics suggests very clearly that not even the biggest countries can stand on their own. So small and large need each other not only to survive COVID, but to survive the negative forces of geopolitics, including the fracture of the multilateral system. The second is the South-South cooperation has already advanced far beyond the traditional aid systems that triggered it. So the South-South cooperation is in the area of trade, investment, cultural exchange, and many more. Thirdly, the leading economies have some real muscle. So it's not the 60s and 70s. There are a number of the South-South, some of them are part of the G20, others are organized around BRICS, and some are neither of these, but are key players in their regional groupings. And finally, economic cooperation institutions have already been built. We have established a number of key institutions on the ground that can be leveraged for not only the current response, but for building better. Now, South-South cooperation cannot simply be around mercantilist reasons, each country seeking to expand its economic and political interests by cooperating with others, or grounded by narrow nationalisms. We have to cooperate for a higher purpose. And as the UN Secretary General has put it, we have to build a better society out of the COVID disaster. And that society has to be fairer, safer, and greener. And this must underpin the solidarity that is needed to create a cooperation framework and cooperate in building and running and creating institutions that help each of our individual countries and regions and collectively to build fairer, better, safer, wealthier, and greener societies. Now, unfortunately, since the COVID disaster, a recent UNCTAD report points to the fact that many of our South groupings have made general and important statements and called for one thing or the other. The G77, even the BRICS. But there are really no collective, concrete proposals on the ground as to how that will underpin a South-South cooperation of a different character. So cooperation on COVID response and recovery therefore needs to be regrounded around an ambition for a different role for cooperation and the role of the South in the global economy and society. And I suggest they can be around four main issues: the scaling up of resources, and the freeing up of fiscal spaces, including on cooperation on tax matters that expand domestic resource mobilization that Lydie spoke elaborately about, building resilient economies as a South economy, which also includes addressing the special cases of low middle income countries that seem to be caught up in a trap, forced into highly expensive sources of capital and unable to grow beyond that low middle income and transform their economies. And the third is cooperating to leapfrog technology for all. And the fourth is building the economic and social infrastructure for resilience. That is for a greener, safer, fairer world. Now, in relation to resources, I think the point has been made that the resource needs are massive. So far, the G20 initiative, in addition to what the IMF, the World Bank, and the smaller regional development banks have provided, do not exceed $200 billion. Far less than even the African Union collective request for emergency support is. Therefore, it's a scratch on the back. Far less than the debt service obligations on these countries falling through in 2020 alone, which is a little more, but and the debt service provision that has been made, under the G20, far less than the debt service obligations that are falling for developing countries in 2020 alone. So what can South-South cooperation do? First is on the liquidity front. And there are institutions, as I said, that can be leveraged. BRICS can extend its contingency reserve arrangements to non-BRICS countries if solidarity underpins the way it acts. Same as other liquidity funds, the Arab Monetary Fund, the Latin American Reserve Fund, and similar liquidity funds, one recently created by the African Development Bank. But on their own, they are insufficient. On a leveraging and a joint coordinated approach, it should be possible to leverage far more resources for liquidity. Debt. The debt stock of developing countries now, including China, exceeds 170% of their combined GDP. The poorest countries pay increasingly a higher percentage, most of their money, to private lenders. Indeed, debt servicing is the largest single expenditure for most developing countries, and that is increasing, and so on. Therefore, South-South cooperation underpinned by solidarity and ambition is necessary to resolve this. And it should promote, for example, on the debt front, debt relief, not just debt standstill. And a common voice is needed for debt. Debt relief should include tackling and creating the legal basis for a more fair and a private debt workout. Innovative measures are needed to address debt. And I think there already are proposals on the table on issues of on things like debt swaps for the SDGs, debt swaps for the environment, and so on. There should be the inclusion of state contingent clauses in private debt contract that enables developing countries to not wait and go begging, and for private debt markets to hold them to ransom when crises like this hit, so they are able to freeze debt servicing and deal with the crisis, the social crisis at hand. And there should be a mechanism is needed for creditor developing countries, so they serve creditor countries to their colleagues. Some collective mechanism is needed to enable a more ambitious approach, more ambitious offering to their poorer and weaker neighbors on debt relief. China can definitely do more for debt relief than the forgiveness of interest-free loans and debt restructuring. So can the Arab countries. But it requires solidarity to look beyond hiding behind the G20 to make very minimal offers to the rest of the South. Now, the other area is developing finance and leveraging the existing institutions. So, as I said, institutions had already been created, and it just needs the spirit of solidarity and ambition to see how they work to both leverage each other and to cover more than their member countries. The Asian Infrastructure Bank, the BRICS Development Bank, the African Infrastructure and Investment Bank. But a coordinated approach is necessary to see how some leverage. But we do not have the institutional frameworks to foster these types of cooperation. And they can collectively breathe life back into revitalizing national development banking that have been destroyed by years and years and repeated structural adjustment programs and the liberalization of the financial sector. Now, on trade, industry, and investment, there's clearly the need, although many countries on the OECD is already providing massive subsidies for their industries and so on and so forth, and many smaller developing countries are hesitant to do so. The least that can be done is a collective call by the South for a WTO peace clause that allow countries that have the capability to support the revitalization of their industries to do so through subsidies. And a cooperation of human and financial resources is necessary to build the necessary infrastructure for the digital economy that my brother just spoke about, for taxation to a digital economy in many of the developing countries is still weak, the infrastructure is poor, and many of them are still struggling to introduce G4 technology, and yet G5 technology is springing ahead. And therefore, they are collectively behind on any of the technologies of the future, which is the fourth industrial revolution. And cooperation is definitely needed for medical research and other research and development. And each can offer, because I think some of the best research capabilities are also in the South. And finally, there has to be cooperation to make small-scale green agriculture successful. The majority of the people in the South live on agriculture, and they are small-scale farmers. An inclusive, fairer economy suggests agriculture, a focus on agriculture, but that is also focused on small farmers. Finally, on cooperation on tax matters, much has been said already, but given the expansion in South-South trade and investment, in order to increase fiscal capacities for countries and avoid certain countries themselves being destinations for IFFs or facilitators of a race to the bottom on tax incentives and tax matters, South-South solidarity is absolutely crucial. Many of our dictators and our corrupt officials and our big and transnational companies are hiding their wealth in new and emerging tax havens, and many of them are in the South. And that's a beggar thy neighbor policy. And therefore, the least that can happen is that each of our institutions, political and economic institutions at the very least, should commit in our own spaces, at least to the ABC of tax justice and the stemming of illicit financial flows, automatic exchange of information, registration and public availability of beneficial ownership registers of companies, and country-by-country reporting of profits, and making that information publicly available. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Abugre. You have really laid out a wide economic canvas from debt to trade to taxation. And certainly there are many important elements of your presentation, especially on how debt servicing is taking up resources which could otherwise have been used for responding to the COVID crisis, amongst others. So I would now proceed to the question and answer session. We have some questions which were sent to us in advance, so I would read those out first, assigning them to the panelists, but if any of the panelists are interested in responding to them, that is also welcome. So the first question has come from Mr. Gaurav Pandir, who's in the Income Tax Department in India. He says that, given that the BEPS agenda is oriented towards developed countries, shouldn't UN Tax Committee spearhead the efforts on behalf of developing countries? This question is for Mr. Eric Mensah. But again, if any of the other committee members would like to respond to it, they are most welcome. The second question is from Patrick Jaramogi from Uganda, who is asked that, would it be wise for governments in the global south to suspend taxes during these hard times of COVID-19? This question is for Mr. Rajat Bansal, who's also a tax administrator like Mr. Eric Mensah. The third question is by Samir Khan with the International Budget Partnership from Canada. His question is, are any of the current policy proposals credible, given the current state of international cooperation and uncertainty about the sustainability of debt moratoria? Reliance on central bank operations is an option for some countries. For others, without a coherent national strategy, hyperinflation is a real threat. Are there deeper structural reforms that need to be considered for countries with different economic conditions? I, if possible, would like to pose this question to both Mr. Ricardo Martner and to Mr. Charles Abugre, who are economists and have spoken about this. So with these introductory questions, I would throw open the floor to the panelists. Gentlemen and ladies, the floor is yours. Mr. Eric Mensah, if we could start with you, if that would be all right.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Abdul. Is it the question on the acceptance of the new drafting proposals? I didn't, it was a little break, so
I'll just repeat the question, Mr. Mensah. It says, given that the BEPS agenda is oriented towards developed countries, shouldn't the UN Tax Committee spearhead the efforts on behalf of developing countries?
In terms of the drafting proposals that we, Mr. Bansal spoke about. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Mensah, we can hear you.
Yes, I think basically the work at the UN is done on consensus basis. So where there's broad acceptance or there are few opposition to a proposal, we make an effort to try and bring everybody on board and to take everybody's position on board. Where there are, it is impossible to bring everybody on board and there are still minority opinions and people feel strongly that they can't live with the proposals. We have the nuclear option. The last option is to put the thing to a vote and then the majority will carry the day. But basically the work of the UN Tax Committee has been to try and achieve general agreement, broad consensus. And as a last resort, we do a vote to carry forward a proposal, whether for or against. So with the current drafting being done by the developing countries, it will come before the committee, main committee, possibly the subcommittee on the digital economy, then the main committee, and then there we will try and achieve consensus on the way forward. If we do that and it's accepted, then it will become part of the model. If there is a strong view as to from a group not interested in having it and the group wanting to have it are unable to reach an agreement, we will take it to a vote.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mensah. Mr. Bansal, if you'd like to respond to the question for you specifically.
Thank you, Abdul. I'd just like to supplement Mr. Mensah on the question asked by Mr. Gaurav Pundir also before taking up the question by Mr. Patrick. So Mr. Gaurav Pundir was referring to possibility of, or rather why that UN should, or rather UN Tax Committee should work towards the interest of developing countries. So that's what I understood from his query. And UN Tax Committee is constituted for mainly keeping the interest of developing countries primarily. That is the mandate of UN Tax Committee. And this is manifested in several ways. As you can see, over the years, UN tax model has succeeded in adding some provisions which are allocating further taxing rights to the developing countries. For example, the last membership of the committee added the article on fees for technical services. And as you know, there is no article on fees for technical services in the OECD model. Similarly, you can see several other articles where there is greater allocation of taxing rights to the developing countries. For instance, in royalties, there is no taxation of royalties under the OECD model at present in the source country, whereas there is in the UN tax model, the taxing rights are shared between the residents and the source country. And so on and so forth. Other example could be the capital gains on alienation of shares in a company. There also UN tax model provides the taxing rights to the source country. And on a macro level, I just like to add that, as you know, the committee is a committee of experts working in their personal capacity. And there has been a demand from the developing countries and possibly from G77 also to upgrade the status of the committee to an intergovernmental committee. This demand has been there for very long. And I remember that in 2017, this demand was very strongly raised at the ECOSOC special session and even otherwise in the UN sessions. So if that happens at some point of time, then UN will become truly UN Tax Committee will become a body truly representing the views of the developing countries and rather views of the world at large. So, from the point of view of working or seeking tax justice, that may be the ideal scenario, which we don't have at this stage. And what was Mr. Patrick's question, Abdul?
So the question,
What was the
yes, sir.
question by Mr.
So the question was, would it be wise for governments in the global south to suspend taxes during these hard times of COVID-19?
Yes, yes. Now I remember. So, as you know, several governments have taken very many measures to alleviate the burden of taxation for the countries, for the general public in these times of COVID pandemic. And the background paper, concept note prepared by South Center and Global Alliance for Tax Justice lists 3 such taxation measures, that is the deadline extensions, payment deferrals, and accelerated tax refunds to lessen the burden on taxpayers and to keep the cash flows of businesses running. So that is one part. But you are referring to complete suspension of the taxation measures at this time. Now, we must keep in mind that governments also need to run to fund the development work as well as the governance apparatus, and most importantly, the pandemic related health measures for which additional revenue is required. So maybe the need is not to suspend the taxation measures altogether, but is to find the niche areas from where revenue can come. So many ideas are being talked about. One is that tax the excess profits. That was an idea in a recent seminar I attended, where Professor Alison Christians put forward that idea. And other idea is to tax those businesses which are doing well in the times of pandemic and tax them in a normal manner, and maybe not tax the other businesses which are not doing well. And third is, of course, the taxation of businesses like digital economies, which are not possible under the current rules and framework. And there is a need to change the framework, and till then unilateral measures have been applied by countries to tax them. So I think the answer is somewhere midway, and not in suspending the taxation measures altogether. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Martner, if you would like to take the question for you.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
As far as I remember, the question was about if the crisis is leading to some kind of a hyperinflation or debt moratoria. For the first part of the question, I believe that well, many countries are suffering from hunger rather than and very huge drop of revenues, especially in the informal sector. So that is leading to an inflation of food, and many communities are delivering lunches or food away from the formal market. So I would say that there's an important rise of prices of food and essential goods. But on the other hand, that same drop of demand has led to diminish, well, oil, of course, and also other prices, namely apartments or well, all the prices of residences, etc. So inflation is, I would say, under control in many of the countries, so under balance. The problem is poverty. The problem is hunger. So the fiscal packages, and also as the question was referring to, the monetary policy has been very active. Fiscal packages are huge, significant. but they are coming too late. I think there is a disbalance between the announcements of fiscal packages and the management of them, because many of our countries or developing countries, as far as I know, are not used to make monetary transfers. So the question of universality versus focusing on vulnerable has been very difficult to manage, and we would like to see something like a more universal transfer for the most of the population, and that's a very deep discussion in many countries. Essentially, the informal sector has been hit very, very strong, and there's no way to go there. So it is very difficult to go there. To say a final word, the question of demand has been treated in a bad way, considering that many of the measures are oriented to supply, to credits, and much less to sustain revenues of the population.
Thank you, Mr. Martner. Mr. Abugre, if you would also like to comment on the question.
Yes, please. I understood the question also to include that, especially when the response also includes quantitative easing measures, the use of the central bank, whether that wouldn't immediately push inflation to hyper levels. Many of these developing countries, I mean, we always keep our back of our mind, they're so varied, but many of them before COVID already were experiencing serious diminishing of their fiscal spaces. Many had run out of the space to borrow. So further borrowing is constrained for many countries. Secondly, normal monetary policy for many countries, interest rates are sticky downwards. So simply buying financial instruments doesn't necessarily always help also to prime the economy. So it leaves really a different use of monetary policy, which is quantitative easing. The central bank putting in money, the way that Europe and America and many others do, and some developing countries also have done so. The debate is really about whether quantitative easing can be different, what people these days call the quantitative easing of the people. So instead of putting the money in the banks, put the money in schools, hospitals, agriculture, and help the government to solve one of its biggest problems. So remember that if you look at the debt figures, for many developing countries, both external and domestic debts, public debt owed by the government externally and domestically, were both rising in tandem. In some countries, domestic debt had overtaken external debt. And what is this debt owed to? It's mainly to local businesses and contractors. If they cannot be paid, they cannot reinvest anything. Therefore, if there is any quantitative easing, put it into paying the contractors, into investing in the schools and the healthcare. And definitely, that always requires some discipline at a certain point. So our public policy always requires some discipline. But if you put it in agriculture and you put it in schools and education, maybe we would emerge with a slightly higher inflation, but with a better capacity to actually drive down inflation and be more resilient in the future, and probably increase government's fiscal space.
Thank you. My next question is for Lydie Naspil. There is a question from Mishek Gova on what are the frameworks available for wealth taxation. So Lydie, if you would like to answer that, please.
Well, we know that there are several wealth taxation, but I think here is that it's based on assets and not just based on income, because the current income tax structures and systems in our countries are so riddled with loopholes, and so and because of all the complicated structures that these income taxes are constructed, then there's a lot of ways that corporations and wealthy families are able to get away from paying. There's lots of examples where it is shown that corporations pay even less taxes than low-income families based on this income tax. So I'd like to invite the source of the question to look at the various proposals already on the table for taxes on wealth and assets. That the proposals are actually talking about various percentages. It's very important also that wealth taxes also take careful consideration on how wealth is recorded and legalized in terms of ownership in the different tax structures in different countries. So I would think that just a universal formula perhaps is not going to be adequate.
Thank you, Ms. Naspil. The next question is for Mr. Rajat Bansal. Considering France struggled to go ahead with unilateral DST facing threat of trade war with the US, what is the political approach that would allow developing countries with lesser geopolitical leverage to pursue such unilateral measures without facing similar retaliatory measures?
That's a difficult one, not easy to answer, and there are no ready answers to this question. I'll only say that I can only give some justification for the unilateral measures. As we all know, there is justification for taxation of digital economy, digital businesses in the market countries or source countries, because the income is emanating from there, and there is every justification for taxation in the country where the demand arises. Like the old example that unless the oranges were plucked, there will be no income from the orchard, so there cannot be any concept of taxation. So similarly, there is justification for taxation of digital businesses, and since the bilateral or multilateral solution is not forthcoming, and this has been going on since 1990s. I think there was something called Ottawa Framework Conference when all this started, and still no solution has been found. So one could not have waited forever. And based on the validation provided in the BEPS Action 1 report, the DSTs or equalization levy have been imposed, and this is of course till the time there is a bilateral mechanism or a agreement multilaterally. So now what should the country do when there is some trade embargo or some trade investigations ordered? So I believe countries are providing justification, or I have not followed it very closely, but I'm aware that representations or replies to those kinds of investigations are being filed. Strictly speaking, I do not find any ready answer to your question, so I'll let it pass at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. The next question is once again for Ms. Lydie Naspil. Is there any example in developing countries regarding suspension of external debt considering the COVID pandemic? And in the specific example of Bangladesh is given, where there has been a lot of job loss and a reduction in incomes due to the impact of COVID. Ms. Naspil.
Yes, actually, there is what is called the debt service suspension initiative that has been decided on by the G20, and which they're also encouraging the private lenders to participate in comparable measure. So this suspension extended to the countries those considered least developed countries by the United Nations. Unfortunately, they're just talking about suspension of payments for a short period of time from May of this year to December end of this year. And it's also involving a small list of countries. We believe there are countries that are not in their list that are also in debt distress and should be offered debt cancellation and debt suspension. And we don't see that debt suspension is actually very helpful, because the debt payments will be resumed after this period, and when they're resumed, the countries will actually be in a tighter spot, because they're going to have to shell out more money in that the instant that the suspension has ended. We have been calling for far broader and deeper debt cancellation and debt relief measures. The IMF has a debt cancellation program, but it's actually a program where IMF is going to mobilize resources in order to pay off the debt payments due to be paid by a small number of countries, about 29 countries, I think. But of course, in the end, the IMF is still securing the interest of lenders, because they're going to pay off the debts. And this is also still very small amounts compared to what is desperately needed. So we believe we have to have, a huge, massive call by citizens and other countries worldwide for debt cancellations to be broader and deeper than what's currently on the table.
Thank you, Ms. Naspil. Toby Quandrel, who is attending the webinar, had a question. He had put up his hand. Toby, if you're on the call, please go ahead and please pose your question to the specific panelist. Okay, well, while Toby responds, if he's still here, I'll move on to the next question. This is by Tony Salvador from the Third World Network, whose question is, aside from wealth tax on individuals and the issues related to taxation at the corporate level, might it also be useful to talk about taxation of individual owners of corporations/shareholders, taxation of dividends, and taxation of capital gains from the sale of shares of stock? I would like to pose this question to Mr. Bansal, and also if Mr. Eric Mensah would have any comments on this, as both members of the UN committee have taken part in deliberations on taxation of capital gains from offshore indirect transfers. Mr. Bansal.
Thank you, Mr. Tony, for your question. I mentioned earlier also that under the UN Tax Convention, there is a provision for taxation of capital gains on alienation of shares. And of course, the UN tax model permits the taxation of dividends from companies also. So the UN Tax Convention does not come in the way of taxing these two kinds of income. And as Abdul mentioned, recently we are working on the indirect capital gains on indirect transfers, which mean that the share of a company which is transferred outside the country, which is intending to tax it, and the value of that share is derived substantially from the assets situated in that country. So like you might have heard about a case in India, a famous case of Vodafone, where such taxation was done, and in the absence of a tax treaty provision, that taxation has been under dispute. So in UN tax model, we are trying to insert a provision, and if you look at the UN Tax Committee website, you will find the developments in this regard, and it's at an advanced stage, and maybe there will be a provision in the UN tax model to permit taxation of such indirect transfers by the source country.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. Mr. Mensah, would you like to also comment on the question?
I think Mr. Bansal has basically said everything because I mean he's very passionate, especially on the indirect transfers and the other provisions that the participant raised. So I would agree completely with Mr. Bansal's answers.
Thank you. We are now out of time for our webinar, so we would like to give all the panelists one final round of remarks, and then we can close the meeting. We would like to start with Ms. Lady Naspel, Madam.
Well, I think what is very, very important is today is the political will of government, especially on the part of sovereign governments, because I think if there's not huge, urgent demands coming from the South, from peoples of the South movements, as well as from governments, we are not going to make much progress here. I think we're seeing that international financial institutions, corporations, rich governments in the South, they're also trying to get in terms of contributing to the collective.
Mr. Mensah, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think it's been a useful exercise, and I know that the issues of achieving an equitable international tax distribution for both developing and developed countries is a very difficult task. But I think also that with this kind of fora, we are able to probably bring our thoughts on what is necessary and what can be done. And again, I must emphasize that Mr. Bansal has been doing a lot of very good work in the UN Tax Committee. Sometimes he doesn't get support even from developing countries and has to really persist. But we're hoping that with this issue of digital economy, we will be able to come out with some measures that would help developing countries and probably help break the impasse and achieve some kind of consensus in the international tax community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mensah, for your optimistic outlook and indeed the need for the developing countries to persevere, for we have no other choice. Mr. Bansal.
So finally, I would say that because these solutions are at least to be bilaterally agreed upon, and so the importance of models like UN Model Tax Convention is cannot be overemphasized. It's very important to have a model which is the guidance for various countries to enter into tax treaties. So how does one achieve that in multilateral forums? In the forums which are dominated by the developed countries, of course, it's quite difficult. And the approach may also be consensus based. So in terms of expertise, as well as in garnering support for a proposal for a developing country oriented proposal, it may be very difficult. But in other forums like UN Tax Committee, where quite a few developing country members are there, so if we can join hands and if we can draft the proposals as well as steer them, because the system here is of majority voting, so that way probably we can achieve a lot. And I really give credit to all our developing country members this time, including Mr. Mensah, that we have joined hands to and are trying to get through at least two very important proposals. One is on taxation of digital economies and the other is on taxation of software payments as royalties. So for this we are working beyond, within the committee and outside the committee jointly, and maybe by the end of this committee's term, we hope that we will be able to bring in something more for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abdul. So it's just a quick issue is that even though COVID-19 has brought a lot of challenges to developing countries, they are also bringing some challenges to developed countries, some of which have actually established the recognition of the elements that developing countries have been developing almost in all multilateral conversations. So now I think that there is a big opportunity, if not a huge opportunity, for developing countries to unite and to, as Mr. Benza was mentioning, to establish a coordinated response to particular mechanisms and effects. I think that South-South cooperation is the basis for doing that, and experiences and expertise developed by developing countries is the most important element that has to be developed and characterized in this kind of discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. There is a question on whether a video recording will be available. Yes, we will be uploading it on the South Center's YouTube channel. We will share it with all the participants who have registered for this call. I would now hand the floor to Mr. Matna. Mr. Matna, your closing remarks, please.
He has left the meeting, Abdul.
He seems to be on the call, but well, in case he seems to be on the call. Mr. Matna, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'll join again.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. Do you hear me? I had a problem with the connection, but I'm coming back. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Matna.
Okay, no, it's just to congratulate all the speakers and thank you for hearing. From the ICRIC point of view, I think the points that I tried to raise, the minimum tax rate and the global asset registry, have a long path to go. It is not the best moment to discuss, but it's at the same time many of the of our countries are taking seriously the issues of progressivity in tax systems. We are progressing on progressive taxes, and that's I think the most important future that we can see. And it is also very important to see that cooperation is one of the main avenues to recover from this at the whole levels, but also at the regional levels. Even if there's many different signs, political signs of governments, I think it's time to so that's my final point.
Many thanks, Mr. Matna. Mr. Abugre, last but not least.
Okay. Anyway, also thank you for having me on the panel. The radio started by articulating his dream of South-South cooperation, in which he compares with the processes that led to the Bandung Conference that created a non-aligned movement. Similarly, in the African region, the processes that led to the decolonization exercise that also led to the creation of the African Union. All of these things are political processes, and they happen when there is political leadership, when there is sufficient numbers of leaders in the major countries that are prepared to put aside a little bit of their self-interest, a little bit of the frustrations of their neighbors, and a little bit of a vision of stretching hands across seas. Then you have effective South-South cooperation. We can only hope that such leadership emerge. Thank you very much.
Indeed, I'm absolutely certain everybody attending this call would share your hope for such leadership from the South. And there are quite a few of them here already, I would say, in my own assessment. So we would like to thank all of you, the speakers, as well as the participants for attending, as well as our colleagues from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for their partnership in carrying out this webinar. We hope it was of use for you. We will continue organizing such seminars, and we look forward to your continued engagement. So thank you very much. Have a nice morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on your time zone, and we wish and best wishes from the South Center.
Thank you. Abdul, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdul.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye from Santiago.
Bye bye.